Joining us to get some perspective on what happened last week and what might happen next week is attorney and legal analyst David Bartick. David, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Before we get to the specifics, let's talk in general terms about how you think the prosecution and the defense did this past week. Both attorneys certainly have different styles, one much more volatile, one much more calm. How do you think that played to the jury?
Absolutely, Rory. First of all, there was no question we saw in opening statements a different type of styles of the two attorneys. Specifically in regard to Jeff Dushek's opening statement, you saw that he was more of a low-keyed, informal type of approach. In his opening statement, he certainly came on very strong in focusing the jury, specifically informing them that this case was going to be about David Westerfield and Danielle Van Dam, trying to take the focus away from the family. He did a very good job in regard to his delivery. More importantly, I think what he does is he not only directs the jury's attention to what he feels is the most important aspects of his case, but he's also able to soften the impact of the lifestyle in regard to the criticism that the Van Dams were going to face during cross-examination by Mr. Feldman. I think it's also important that he went right to the fact that there was some very inconsistent statements allegedly made by Mr. Westerfield. He talked about the fact that the inconsistent statements in regard to the weather at the Silver Strand. He talked about the inconsistent statements in regard to whether or not he had his wallet on him. And then, of course, some new information that we found out, which is about the fact that the trailer that had the sand toys, allegedly Mr. Westerfield made a comment that those sand toys were on the trailer and that the trailer had a flat tire in El Centro. It will be interesting to see how that plays out with this case. In regard to Mr. Stephen Feldman, I think you saw that he was a very energetic, very dramatic, very animated. He's a type of individual who changes his pace, changes his voice inflection. He's also an individual who can not only be very strong, but I've seen him in trial where he can lower his voice to such an extent that he softens it and he can really have the jury right at the edge of their seats. Both of these attorneys are extremely professional, very well prepared, and needless to say, we have very interesting several weeks of trial testimony ahead of us.
Now, in the opening statements, which we were just looking at video from the opening statements, very obvious, the attorneys both laid out their cases. Dushek says, we're going to look at the evidence, and the evidence is going to point you to the killer. Mr. Feldman says there is reasonable doubt to know who the killer was, who kidnapped this child, and of course the evidence, in his terms, is not conclusive. So that's really what the case is about, is it not? Despite, one person could be very quiet, soft-spoken, professional, straightforward. The other can be dramatic, artistic, whatever you want to say, vindictive. But it all comes down to what you can convince a jury to believe.
Bernard, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no question this case is going to come down to what the facts, what the evidence is as presented to the jury. And Mr. Feldman, of course, is going to focus, at least I believe with the witnesses that we've seen so far, on the lifestyles of the Van Dams. Now, it's important to keep in mind, Mr. Westerfield is not indicating that Brendan or Damon Van Dam were responsible. I mean, they're not on trial. The jury realizes that. Mr. Feldman realizes that. But what he is doing is showing that there was perhaps an opportunity for some other individual. We refer to this as third-party culpability. So he's painting a picture in that there's an opportunity for the type of individuals that may have come into the household that may have been responsible for this heinous crime.
Let's look a little bit at how he painted that picture, because Steve Feldman certainly grilled Damon Van Dam on the stand about his lifestyle. Let's look at a little bit of that testimony.
On at least 3 separate occasions, you had had sexual intercourse with Barbara Easton prior to February 1st.
No.
How many times?
Once.
With regard to Denise Kemmel, had you had intimate relations with Denise Kemmel?
By intimate relations, again, you mean sex? Yes.
And, of course, a little bit later on, Feldman basically reiterating what the jury already knew, but maybe for dramatic effect, with Brenda Van Dam, the same thing. I think we have that video ready to go as well. Why don't we take a look at that?
Certainly.
Was October 2001 the first time you had sex with Denise?
You need to repeat that question. You have the dates wrong.
Okay, I'm sorry. What date was it that was the first? Couple of other points.
David, she was a little, well, understandably reluctant to really answer his questions. That was just one of the times in which she didn't really answer straightforwardly. It took him about 5 questions sometimes to finally get her to answer.
I don't know if she was reluctant as much as saying, you got your facts wrong.
Well, at that point, but later on in the trial, though, he kept grilling her, and she was reluctant. In fact, when he was asking her about whether she had intimate relations with other women, she really didn't want to come out and say that. How do you think that's playing with the jury? Is she
Well,
looking sympathetic, or is she looking like somebody who wants to withhold?
That reluctance is certainly understood. I mean, I felt that during her testimony in regard to Brenda Van Dam, it was quite a bit different than the preliminary hearing testimony that we saw earlier. She seemed much more confident. There's no question that she's been through an ordeal that really none of us can really appreciate. It's just a horrendous situation. And I felt that during that testimony, you felt sorry for her. So I think that certainly it had a significant impact on the jury. But what I think is really important is in regard to a legal analysis, during the preliminary examination, both Damon and Brenda testified, and that was very unusual. And actually extremely, because the reason why is because at that hearing they don't have to bring in the witnesses. They can have actually police officers come in and testify in regard to the statements. But I really think it was a brilliant tactic by Mr. Duszek, because what it did was twofold. First of all, it kind of lessened the rumors, all these rumors that were within the community about all this type of behavior. But secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, is what it did was it gave both Brenda and Damon an opportunity to get comfortable in the courtroom, an opportunity to be in that courtroom, an opportunity to speak to Mr. Feldman, have him question them, see what that interaction was going to be like. And then when we came in before the jury, at the jury trial, she appeared to be much more confident. Her body language was much different. There were some looks that she gave to Mr. Westerfield, which were very striking, and I think that truly had an emotional impact with the jury.
She was glaring at him.
Well, Mr. Bartick, we appreciate you being here this morning. It's going to be an interesting week, the second week, no doubt about it, and of course all of this leading to who really did kidnap and kill that young child.
No question. It's going to be interesting and exciting.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Rory.
Thanks, David. We'll see you soon.